it's my privilege to turn over the podium to the content man, Mr. Ed Dirigian, who really doesn't need an introduction.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you for the great work you're doing for the round table as the chairperson. It's a tough job, and a lot of progress has been made. I would like to make a few announcements before I have the privilege of announcing our distinguished speaker tonight. First, at the Baker Institute, we have, as Nancy indicated in one part, two very important new staff assignments to the Baker Institute. Actually, they're critical assignments to the future of the Baker Institute. One is the new Associate Director of the Baker Institute for Academic Programs, Dr. Alan Matisow, one of the most distinguished professors at Rice University, the former Dean of Humanities, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about Alan, and I won't say any more at this point, on October 17th when he's going to make a presentation to the round table at the dinner. I don't know if Alan is here tonight, but he is going to be helping me strategize the future of our whole research and academic and substantive programs at the Baker Institute. So this is a critical appointment. The other very important appointment is the appointment of a development officer for the Baker Institute, Molly Hibb. And Molly has come on board just very recently, and she has a very impressive background in development. She was the Director of Development and External Relations at Austin Museum of Arts, Development Consultant to the Texas Fine Arts Association in Austin, Associate Director of the Capital Campaign of the Texas Nature Conservancy in San Antonio, and Managing Partner of Image Makers, Corpus Christi, Texas. I told her not to try to do anything on my image because, as my wife tells me, that's mission impossible. But in any case, I would like Molly to stand up and for you to recognize her. Molly Hibb, welcome on board. As Nancy said, there are some very interesting programs coming up, some of which are open generally, some of which are more restricted. Tom Friedman is coming to have breakfast with Rice University students. Unfortunately, we couldn't get him for a larger audience because of his handlers, which means the agents. We are going to have a U.S.-Russian Energy Summit, which is going to be a very important forum on Russian energy issues and U.S.-Russian cooperation on energy. We're going to have leading people coming at the ministerial level and the secretarial level to that. And where on the October 11th through the 13th, the Baker Institute is hosting the world, concomitantly with the World Space Congress in Houston, the Space Policy Summit. This is going to be a very important summit at the ministerial level and technical level of international representatives to discuss space policy and the elaboration of space policy on civil, environmental, security, and commercial use of space. And there will be some seating available for that, and we'll be in touch with you. It'll be on a restricted basis, but we will be working with you through Nancy on that. And there are other things coming on the rest of the year, as Nancy mentioned, which I won't go into. I am particularly pleased now to introduce our distinguished speaker. First, our speaker's subject, Clash of Civilizations, New World Disorder, or New World Order, could not be more timely or urgent. Just last week, we commemorated the first anniversary of the horrifying and tragic events of September 11th. And we have embarked on a vital national and international debate on how best to address the threat presented by Saddam Hussein's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. Both the ongoing war against terror and possible military action against Iraq raise fundamental questions of international world order and stability and security. So how can we ensure security in the short run? How can we promote stability in the longer term? And perhaps most importantly of all, how can we defend order against the deadly perils of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction? How we answer those questions as a people, as a nation, and the international community is critical. It will shape the future and the world for years and decades to come. We look forward to tonight's talk as an important contribution to what is truly a historic debate in our country and in the world. But there's another reason I'm delighted to present our speaker, and Arnaud de Borchgrave is one of the leading journalists and personalities that I have ever met. His CV is most impressive. You have a short synopsis in your program. I would like to add to that in a lengthy profile, Esquire magazine said that in 33 years, de Borchgrave covered 17 wars and more than 90 countries and traded gossip with Anwar Sadat, sipped tea with Pham Van Dong in Hanoi, and was a house guest of King Hussein's. In a job that requires bluff and bravado, he has outrun the best of them. He has interviewed most of the world's leaders during the last 2 decades. His war reporting included 7 tours of duty in Vietnam, where he was wounded twice. In 1981, he walked more than 100 miles behind Angolan lines to get the first interview with 2 Soviet airmen who had been shot down by anti-Marxist guerrilla forces. And in 1979 and 1980, he covered the invasion of Afghanistan. Theodore White, universally acclaimed as the best and most prominent journalist of the 20th century, wrote that Arnaud de Borchgrave is one of America's great foreign correspondents. He's a man of immense wisdom, solid common sense, and enormous sophistication. He said, I know a few correspondents in the past 50 years who have had his subtle knowledge of international relations and the personalities that mesh those relations. I had to encounter Arnaud when I was Deputy Press Secretary at the White House for President Reagan. I used to cultivate the Washington Post to take care of the liberals, and then I would call the editor-in-chief of the Washington Times to cultivate the conservatives. He was a tough editor, but a man of great integrity and great insight. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Arnaud de Borchgrave.
Thank you, Ed, Mr. Secretary, Susan, Mr. Ambassador, and Françoise, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a fabulous honor for me to be invited to address the now world-famous Baker Institute at Rice University. But as Adlai Stevenson once said, flattery is marvelous, provided you don't inhale. You know, there are two principles to keep in mind when you're addressing such a stellar group of experts, all of you with, I'm sure, brilliant backgrounds in various fields of human endeavor. And the 2 principles are as follows. The first one is the Henry Kissinger principle of alarm. When in doubt, sound pessimistic, because then you appear to be much better informed. And this school believes that only vacuous fatheads tell good news. And if the catastrophe you predicted does not come to pass, you can always give yourself credit for having averted it and go back to the top of the class. The other principle is less well known. It's named after Henry J. Bonura. I don't think too many people here can remember who he was. He played for the White Sox and the Senators prior to World War II. He was known as Zeke Bananas Bonura. He died about 10 years ago, still holding to this very day the worst fielding record in the history of baseball. But Bananas Bonura remembered one very important principle about baseball, and that is that you cannot be charged with an error unless you touch the ball. I think before you criticize someone in our profession, we should always remember or try to put yourself in their shoes and walk for a mile, because by then, of course, you have their shoes. And no, seriously, H.L. Mencken's characterization of my profession, I think, was the very best I've ever read. It's an evergreen. The only qualities for real success are rat-like cunning, a plausible manner, and a little literary ability. The capacity to steal other people's ideas and phrases is also invaluable. Reporting from Afghanistan, as I have, as you heard, since the Soviet invasion, but 5 times since 9/11, it reminds me of a famous British correspondent who was reporting from Afghanistan in the 19th century, and before filing a dispatch to his Fleet Street editor, he said, "It would be difficult to exaggerate the horror of events unfolding here, but I shall do my best." You know, prior to 9/11, almost any English language newspaper anywhere in the developing world, and I don't mean the developed world, the developing world, carried more foreign news than our 2 or 3 major dailies combined. Since the end of the Cold War, editors and TV producers decided in their infinite wisdom that Americans didn't care about foreign news anymore. So they focused instead on much easier to cover and less expensive to cover domestic stories. That gave us, of course, the constant melodrama of constant trivia, from Tonya Harding, the infamous skater, and the Pew Foundation decided, after conducting a very scientific study, that Tonya Harding got more press coverage in a comparable news period than the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we went from Tonya Harding to Monica Lewinsky, and from, of course, O.J. Simpson to Gary Condit. Poor Condit was finally liberated by Osama bin Laden. But it seems to me that all of this blinded us to the new forces shaping the developing world, particularly the Muslim world. During most of the 1990s, editors and TV producers, of course, focused on not only on all these stories, but as you may recall, our evening TV newscasts frequently relegated the rest of the world to a single news item. For the major conglomerates and mega companies that own our media giants, the bottom line, of course, reigned supreme. I've experienced that myself. The public good became a sort of quaint concept relegated to academic debates, as was indeed the journalistic duty of taking what's important and making it interesting. Thus, the famous, or at least for me it was famous, because it's something I've been lecturing about for a long time, the famous Hart-Rudman Presidential Commission report and the Bremer Commission report were greeted by the mainstream media without the slightest degree of interest. They both foretold weapons of mass destruction terrorism at home in the United States, and they recommended 24 different things, and Congress, of course, did not act because the media, in my judgment, did not deem these things to be important. So the dumbing down of the media led to the dumbing down of America. W.C. Fields, who was a man not exactly noted for his religious convictions, was on his deathbed reading the Bible when a friend said to him, "What are you doing?" He said, "Looking for loopholes." Which I think is an very appropriate allegory for how the governments in the Western world and the media have been behaving since our twin victories in the Cold War and the Gulf War, until September 11, that is. Now we have 24/7 television coverage, fills the airtime with people who don't have the slightest idea what they're talking about, but they say it very well. You have pundits and journalists, exchangeable, who should not be exchangeable, but now you can be a pundit and a journalist at the same time. A new journalism of assertion has replaced the journalism that I grew up with, the journalism of verification. What's true or what's not true is no longer the compass bearing as it used to be. Now the gossip, innuendo, rumor, disinformation, misinformation, all mixed together and transmitted on our global town crier called the Internet, served up as fact. You'd be surprised how many young journalists today do very little shoe leather reporting, but rely almost entirely on what they can find out through the Internet. The talking heads, as I'm sure you would agree, you've seen me on MSNBC or CNBC, the talking heads are frequently an embarrassment to our profession. These are the shows where you have to give an opinion, informed or not, right or wrong, it doesn't matter. There is no penalty for absurdity. You get your own show if you're absurd enough, like the fellow I was with at Tora Bora shortly before last Christmas, Geraldo Rivera. We now have Larry King interviewing Chris Matthews, and Chris Matthews interviewing Larry King. That's what I call incestuous journalism. Prior to 9/11, the fact that Osama bin Laden was running a global terror network in 60 different countries around the world was unknown to about 99% of Americans. I picked this figure out of thin air, but I think it's fairly accurate. Nor did 99% of Americans know that Quranic schools in Pakistan, the so-called madrasas, were supplying an endless line of recruits to terrorist organizations and went on to training in Afghanistan. Or that these 12,000 madrasas in Pakistan, I spent a lot of time in these madrasas during the past year, were teaching about 1 million young Pakistanis to hate America, hate India, and hate Israel. Or that this network of madrasas were almost entirely funded by our good friend Saudi Arabia. Not the government of Saudi Arabia, but this is a sort of not a very important nuance. It was the Saudi Wahhabi clergy. Of course, it's very easy for the government to say now that they didn't really know what their clergy was up to. Nor did 99% of Americans know that Muslim fanatics had won the hearts and minds of the Muslim masses while they chloroformed the silent majority into acquiescent submission. At the turn of the last century, let's remind ourselves what was going on. Hitler was 11 years old, Mussolini was 17, and Lenin was 30. Incidentally, Mussolini was a pacifist in those days when he was 17. And then you had Lenin, who was 30, about to go into exile after a brief internment in Siberia. No one had ever heard of Nazis or fascists, and communists were just simply socialists without a sense of humor. 4 years into the 20th century, Japan suddenly bursts onto the world stage and sinks the entire Russian fleet in one day. In 1910, a runaway international bestseller was The Grand Illusion by Norman Angell, whose thesis was that the great powers were now so economically interdependent that another war was unthinkable. And 4 years later, of course, the war to end all wars was triggered by an assassin's bullet in Sarajevo, and the 20th century turned out to be the bloodiest in human history. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest here is that political forecasting and economic prognostication have made astrology look respectable. Saul Bellow once said a great deal of intelligence can be invested in ignorance when the need for illusion runs deep. And as we all know, the need for illusion is an evergreen commodity. In his book, The Pursuit of the Ideal, Isaiah Berlin wrote that utopias have their value. Nothing so wonderfully expands the imaginative horizons of human potentialities, but as a guide to conduct, they can prove literally fatal. All I can say with a reasonable degree of certainty this evening, and I've been in this nutty business called the media for 56 years, all I can say with a reasonable degree of certainty is that the world is a lot safer tonight than it will be 10 years from now. Much global turmoil lies ahead as the forces of nationalism, fundamentalism, globalism, and increasingly, incidentally, transnationalism, and there is a difference between the two, as all these forces sort themselves out. Somebody, somewhere, is planning to take the lead in a post-capitalist world, a system that the teeming, impoverished billions of the developing world can identify with. And if present trends continue, I know this is a rather shocking statement, but if present trends continue, with democratic governance dominated by political leaders whose main concern is how to get themselves reelected, democracy and the public good may be deemed incompatible yet again, as indeed they were in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. I don't think it takes rocket science to figure out the damage done to America's image as the citadel of democratic capitalism by the age of gluttony on Wall Street, which we are still living. These crypto-capitalist saboteurs are the fodder that feeds transnational progressivism, which very few people have heard of, that is the new liberal ideology rooted in NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We journalists tend to lose sight of our responsibility to inform, of course, but also to illuminate and dramatize major events and trends, trends rather than events, so that our political leaders can muster the courage to resort to unpopular measures that will later be seen as acts of visionary statesmanship. The Middle East and our Israel can do no wrong and is run by a great man of peace policy is an obvious case in point. With the advent of nanotechnology, the world of the invisible, and Rice University is at the very heart of this with Dr. Smalley, we will see more change within the next 10 years than we've seen during the last 100 years. Hewlett-Packard recently took out a patent for a breakthrough technology that can be used to make computers as small as a speck of dust. There is already you saw the picture in the papers not too long ago, a cell phone that is so small it can be implanted in a tooth. I'm just wondering how you dial at that point, probably a lot of chattering of teeth. So the technological revolution is bound to be an integral part of whatever emerges in the next few years, as these invisible molecular structures embedded in conventional chips will be worn, ingested, or implanted. Imagine entire chemical labs the size of a computer chip. They're coming. Technology obviously is neutral, but one can easily imagine how the forces of evil in the world will harness technology to their objectives. Nations, as we all know today, can no longer be challenged with conventional military strength, or some of these nations can no longer be challenged with conventional military strength because of their overwhelming superiority. And here, of course, we're thinking of the United States and Israel. So they're now faced with asymmetric warfare. According to documents found in Kabul when I was there a few months ago, documents found in Kabul indicated that the infamous attack on the USS Cole in Aden, in the harbor of Aden in October 2000 was done for $10,000. In other words, for 10 grand, they managed to immobilize a $1 billion warship for 14 months, and the repair bill was $250 million. That was a classic case of asymmetric warfare. 9/11 was the ultimate in low-cost, low-tech, high-return terrorism, because for less than $500,000, the Al-Qaeda suicide bombers inflicted damage estimated to be about $700 billion to the U.S. economy. So the sinews of American power have become the target, whether we're talking about the oil installations in Saudi Arabia, supertankers in the Straits of Hormuz, the New York Stock Exchange, water treatment plants, or cyber attacks to discombobulate the national power grid. All today have become fair game. One of the 17 million cargo containers that comes into this country every year, whether it's by sea or by air or by land, through some 300 different ports of entry, are the obvious delivery vehicle for a weapon of mass destruction. Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation, was at CSIS recently and shared with us his concerns about private aviation. We have about 200,000 private planes in the United States, some 500,000 private pilots, and some 18,000 airfields which they use. A G4 today can carry the same amount of explosive, or more than the same amount of explosive power that destroyed the federal building in Oklahoma. So a G4 could potentially carry a more devastating load, explosive load, than the jetliners that crashed into the towers and the Pentagon. And when we fly private or company jets, I'm sure you've noticed this over and over again since 9/11, there is no checking of the luggage. Non-state actors today, even individuals, can wield destructive capabilities once controlled exclusively by nation states. Would-be terrorists can melt into our open society with the wherewithal to carry out devastating attacks on a seemingly endless list of targets. Witness the 6 Yemeni-born Americans who were arrested in Buffalo last weekend. President Bush is absolutely right to keep on repeating that we are not at war with Islam. Unfortunately, radical Islam is indeed at war with the United States. And let's never forget that revenge for perceived societal wrongs is always just a few keystrokes away. That is the new dimension of transnational terrorism. If terrorism is the act of the powerless, mastery of the computer compensates for that act, or that feeling of powerlessness. The next generation of anti-US terrorists, I submit, understands that a hand on a mouse is far more devastating than a finger on a trigger. The two installations in this country, one in Massachusetts and the other in Oregon, control the supply of electric power in 42 states. Bill Hancock, the top computer scientist at the Exodus Company, I heard him at a closed meeting recently organized by C34 at the Pentagon. This guy with his laptop sitting in the Admiral's Lounge of Heathrow Airport managed to close down London's most important airport by disrupting the automated baggage loading and distribution system. One man with a laptop and no special knowledge. I mean, he knows how to operate a computer, but certainly didn't have any access to the codes of Heathrow Airport prior to this attempt. America's vulnerabilities are well known to the enemy. Bin Laden has read and studied Tom Clancy. We clearly were not prepared. I don't think that President Bush was prepared for the malevolent combination of human ingenuity and its capacity for evil. The paradigm shift, I submit, is arguably more profound today than the beginning of the Cold War, which I went through at the end of World War II. As the only journalist who's ever interviewed Mullah Omar, the top Taliban guy, this was in Kandahar 3 months before 9/11, I take what he said after the terrorist attacks very seriously. And I quote, "The plan to destroy America is going ahead, and God willing it is being implemented. But it is a huge task beyond the will and comprehension of human beings. If God's help is with us, this will happen within a short period of time." Exaggeration, obviously, but be careful. In a survey conducted in Pakistan, where I've spent a lot of time in my life, first war I covered in that part of the world was 1965. In a survey conducted in Pakistan late last year, 83% of male adults in Pakistan believe that Osama bin Laden is a freedom fighter and not a terrorist. In Pakistan, too, President Musharraf estimates fundamentalist extremists at roughly 10% of his population. That would be 14 million people. Extrapolating from these figures, and I have no reason to doubt that these are pretty correct. I spent a lot of time, as I told you, in Pakistan. I've spent entire nights with some of the more extremist religious leaders. It's pretty chilling stuff. But extrapolating from these figures, roughly 100 million Muslims out of a total world population of 1.2 billion Muslims in some 50 countries share this fundamentalist belief that the Judeo-Christian world's main objective is to destroy Islam. A year after 9/11, there are still 600,000 young Pakistani males in the very same madrasas whose mullahs have rejected any kind of reform from President Musharraf, and they are still to this day subsidized by the Saudi Wahhabi clergy. Pakistan, which has a nuclear arsenal, as well as some Islamist generals and an inter-services intelligence agency whose culture is totally anti-American, except at the very top, is a far more dangerous situation today, in my judgment, than Iraq. For President Musharraf to abandon Pakistan's pro-Taliban policy after a phone call from President Bush immediately after 9/11 was one thing. But for President Musharraf to then, under combined U.S. and international pressure, to renounce his own Kashmir policy, which was really ditching something that is sacrosanct in Pakistan, is far worse than what he did in the eyes of public opinion in Pakistan than abandoning Taliban. In a recent off-the-record session, I get this from one of the editors who was present, in a recent off-the-record session with Pakistan's 32 leading editors with President Musharraf, 3 of them called Musharraf to his face a coward. And not one editor was willing to support him for his acquiescence to U.S. wishes on Kashmir. One editor even said, "Let's face up to our duty and let war commence." Not one editor spoke up against war. So in my judgment, the new Afghanistan is Pakistan, not Iraq. After these 5 assignments I've had in that part of the world since 9/11, it is very hard for me to escape the conclusion that we do not understand enough about our enemies. During the Cold War, we nurtured an entire army of specialists and experts who spanned a vast array of skills. Everything we wanted to know about our enemies, we knew. They had a perfect understanding of the subversive enterprises of our major adversaries and enemies, down to the individual personalities of their leaders. We knew who they were, their histories, numbers, location, habits, routines, movements, who their friends were in the West, their military command and control systems, their weaknesses and how to exploit them, and how to discourage them from taking a course of action that would damage U.S. interests and those of our friends and allies. Now the rising specter of asymmetric warfare is forcing us to re-examine virtually all aspects of intelligence, warfighting, and public safety. Situational awareness has a whole new meaning when the battle space includes our homes and families. Our new enemies possess a combination of strong will, knowledge of our society, significant human and financial resources, and an intense hatred of just about everything we stand for. The Internet has provided the transnational terror network with cheap, secure, and robust point-to-point communications and a cultural tool of unprecedented power. With secret microsites, this is something that was new to me at this briefing not too long ago in Washington, but this gentleman from the Exodus Company had unearthed in 3 days 13 microsites. These are covert, secret sites within your own website, and they communicate with another legitimate website, inside which is another member of the same organization. And these things were in Arabic, and apparently once the Arabic was translated, they were still in code, but it took the FBI 2 weeks to be able to respond to this particular alert. We also have steganographies, which I'm sure many of you have read about, encoded messages hidden inside one of the millions of family pictures that are transmitted over the net every day. So Al-Qaeda now gets secure encrypted email, websites for recruiting, and Usenet groups for posting encoded messages, current maps, and even overhead satellite photography, which, as you probably know, these days is available commercially down to a resolution of 10 feet. For those of you who may not have seen or heard the news this evening, Saddam Hussein has accepted inspections immediately with no conditions. Well, this was clearly designed to head off a U.S. military action and, of course, regime change. So the clear sailing that President Bush had quite recently, a few days ago, will obviously become a little muddied tomorrow. But what troubles me about war with Iraq is that before hostilities have even started, it has already become a distraction from the war against transnational terror. Iraq and Al-Qaeda are not synonymous evils, but a U.S. military operation that is not sanctioned by the UN or by the UN Security Council could quickly drive Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden into each other's arms. Hopefully, President Bush's brilliant diplomatic strokes at the UN last week will bring the Security Council to its senses with a demand that its resolutions be implemented with a U.S.-led international force to back it up. Secretary Baker, as you I'm sure read, laid out the perfect scenario in the Washington Post yesterday. But I'm not holding my breath, especially given tonight's development. And if we were to throw the first punch, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind, and there is a mountain of evidence to support this, Saddam will hit back. As he said in a leaked story to a Kuwaiti newspaper at the end of June, he will hit back on all fronts with all weapons, and I think we know what that means. If Saddam feels that his regime is about to crash in flames, we can expect chemical and biological weapons against Israel at the very least, and of course against our own troops, and the activation of sleeper cells here and abroad. Israel clearly would retaliate, and the streets of the Arab world, already filled with hatred over our lack of even-handedness in the Israeli-Palestinian problem, would most probably erupt. And friendly Arab governments such as Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia are terrified that they would be next on the regime change hit parade. A unilateral attack against Iraq would be seen, in my judgment, by the 1 billion plus Muslims from Malaysia to Morocco, and including the 20 million Muslims living in Western Europe and the 5 million Muslims we have in the United States, as aggression aided and abetted by Israel. Even the moderate imams I've talked to in this country, all the way from Princeton University to the House of Islamic Wisdom in Dearborn Heights, Michigan, still believe that 9/11 was engineered by Mossad and the CIA. And Jordanian television, Jordan, close friend of ours, King Abdullah, great admirer of the United States, Jordanian television last week had a documentary purporting to prove that 9/11 was done by Mossad. A preemptive attack launched against a country that has not yet attacked the United States or its allies is, of course, as we all know, a major departure in geopolitics. Given the preponderance of U.S. global power, there is no doubt at all that the U.S. would prevail in Iraq. But what concerns me more than anything is the aftermath of such a war, and of course the law of unintended consequences. The war in Afghanistan has already cost $30 billion or more, and regime change in Kabul, as you know, has been a limited success, a rather shaky hold in Kabul itself, but the rest of the country is more or less ruled by the old warlords before Taliban took over. Little thought and even less planning has gone into what to do about post-war Iraq, the way we planned at the height of World War II and had a blueprint ready for post-war Germany and post-war Japan. A new multi-ethnic democratic Iraq, which is now, as you all know, a Stalinist police state with no rule of law and a secret police numbering about 150,000, to move from there to a democratic regime is a huge undertaking. Wars, as I think we should all know by now, do not solve problems. They only determine who is going to solve these problems. The last Gulf War spawned the evil of Osama bin Laden. Let's not forget that. I first met that man when he was 14 years old in Jeddah. His father was a good friend of mine. So you wonder whether Gulf War II, if it occurs, will not create a new generation of bin Ladens, this time with weapons of mass destruction. As difficult as it is for citizens of the United States to understand, bin Laden remains a sort of Che Guevara type hero to countless millions of young Islamist extremists. Some pundits have been writing that this is a clash not of civilizations, but a clash of two worlds, the civilized world and the barbaric world. I wish it were that simple. I think one has to be irredeemably myopic not to see that the breeding grounds of transnational terrorism are in regions that are impoverished and where 60% of the population is less than 21 years of age. Out of 6 billion people on our planet today, 1/3, or 2 billion people, are 14 years of age or less. Terrorism is the weapon of choice of the weak against the strong and has been that way from time immemorial. Let us also remember that the totalitarian temptation has existed from time immemorial. President Bush, in his op-ed piece in last Wednesday's New York Times, wrote that poverty does not transform poor people into terrorists and murderers. Quite right. But despair does indeed breed violence among the helpless and the hopeless. The ever-worsening misery of the Palestinians in those refugee camps does indeed beget terrorism, just as destitute Pakistani parents send their kids to these madrasas where they get free room and board, and where the only discipline taught is learning the Quran by heart and why they should hate America and Jews. These are the breeding grounds, in my judgment, that spawn al-Qaeda recruits. Our relations with the Arab world should not consist, obviously, of turning our back on Israel. That's not what I'm suggesting. But they do require, on our part, an aggressive policy to midwife a Palestinian settlement. The Saudi initiative, for instance, of Crown Prince Abdullah a few months ago, for normal diplomatic and economic relations with Israel for all Arab countries in return for the dismantling of all Jewish settlements on the West Bank and a return to the 1967 borders, was, in my judgment, the most promising development I've seen in the Middle East since Sadat's assassination 21 years ago. Unfortunately, we didn't pick up the ball and run with it, and now, of course, we've done other things such as dragging Iran into an axis of evil that played right into the hands of the worst elements in Iran. The message that the Middle East has been hearing from Washington, according to Tony Cordesman, who said this publicly last week upon the 40th anniversary of CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the message they've been hearing from America is petty, mean, intolerant, and that we despise our friends as much as we do our enemies. And Tony Cordesman is a staunch Republican. I've been covering the Middle East on and off since 1951, and I find it very hard to disagree. Erich Hoffer, some of you may remember, was the man in the streets philosopher, once said that one of the most spectacular privileges of intellectuals is that they are free to demonstrate scandalous stupidity without ever jeopardizing their reputations. That is a privilege that we journalists have availed ourselves of from time to time, sometimes with reckless abandon. Present company, of course, accepted. Thank you for your patient attention.
Arnaud has very generously accepted to answer questions from the audience, so if you raise your hand and wait for the microphone to get to you before you ask your question. Please, we have one here.
I was wondering, in the wake or the aftermath of Daniel Pearl's assassination, how do you guard against your own safety, or does that ever concern you when you're interviewing all these terrorists and scary people?
Yes, but what I did was always be accompanied by my UPI team, and I had an interpreter, driver, security person. But usually I tried to do all of my interviews at the Marriott Hotel in Islamabad when these people were coming into town, such as some of these extremist leaders like Samiul Haq and Fazul Rahman. These are the most extremist religious leaders. They have big political parties. But I would not go and see them in some restaurant or cafe that if I was not properly surrounded. So I did most of my interviews in hotels.
Mr. de Borchgrave, I'm rather confused about our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And you have talked tonight about how they are funding madrasas in Pakistan, much less in their own country. Here we have a regime that is very, very rich at the top. They've built no infrastructure in their country. They haven't educated their people. And here they are fostering terrorism against us, and yet today they say, oh, maybe we can land on their territory if we're going to pursue a war, we, the UN, or whoever. Can you give us a little more insight about Saudi Arabia and what, if you were president, what you would be doing about Saudi Arabia?
Ignore the last part of that question.
Not being a foreign-born U.S. citizen, that's never even crossed my mind. But seriously, Pakistan is not directly subsidizing terrorists or promoting terrorism. What happened back in 1979 is the Islamist extremists managed to take over the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And they couldn't get them out of the catacombs. The siege, the people running the siege held out for 3 weeks. And the Saudi government had to turn to France. The head of Saudi intelligence, young Prince Turki at the time, turned to his mentor and guru, the head of French intelligence, Count de Marange. And they sent a team in to Mecca, and they managed to get, after 3 weeks of trying, they got them out of the catacombs. That is when this deal was made between the Saudi House of Saud, the royal family, and the clergy. The deal was, I'm summarizing it, obviously more complex than that, but the deal in essence was, you, the clergy, will not criticize the extravagant excesses of the royal family. You cannot touch the royal family. In exchange, generous subsidies to spread Wahhabism around the world. That is where it went wrong. And the clergy is more or less, if you take what's happened in the United States, about 2,000, there are 2,000 mosques in the United States, well-known mosques. Over half of them have been funded by Wahhabis, by the Wahhabi clergy. And we have one in across the river in Washington. Washington, as you know, is that area of 10 square miles surrounded by reality. Just outside of Washington, across the river in Virginia, there is a religious establishment paid for by the Saudis, and the Washington Post managed to get some of the things that the kids were being taught there, and they're horrifying about the United States.
How did you correct that?
Well, of course, it's very difficult as long as you are dependent on Saudi oil. I know that the dependence has been greatly reduced in recent times. They have been talked to about this, but it's very difficult for the House of Saud to take on their own clergy. They hoist on their own petard at this point.
Mr. Borchgrave, when you met with Mullah Omar and he gave you a rather chilling report, and what did you do with that information?
Oh, no.
What could you do with it?
I'm sorry, maybe I spoke too fast. I said that after my interview with him, which was June 4th of last year, I took what he said after 9/11 very seriously, based on my own experiences with the man. But everything he told me was published. I didn't hold anything back, and nothing was off the record. A very tall guy, one eye, wounded 5 times while fighting the Soviets during the occupation of Afghanistan. Clearly a man who sort of belongs to a totally different century, what I call the flat earth clergy in Saudi Arabia. The only candid thing he said basically was that we in this country are 300 years behind your country, so don't expect us to do things the way you do things. Eventually things will change here. Of course they did with 9/11.
Your message is not very hopeful for 10 years. Is there really no hope?
There's always hope, sir.
I hope there's hope.
Of course there's hope. The forces of good and evil are battling each other all the time. And we've got to keep battling. But let's not think that peace is a normal human condition, given the fact that in 5,000 years of recorded history, there have been 5,800 wars. It doesn't mean you go on striving for peace, but it's going to be increasingly difficult, in my judgment, in the years to come. François.
You know so much about Pakistan, and I wanted to ask you about this new friendship we have.
They want you to use the microphone.
The new friendship with President Musharraf. How much faith can we put into that, and is he not harboring or giving safe haven to Osama bin Laden?
Well, I brought with me something that may interest you, because it's from, I'm sure many of you have heard of a man who writes about intelligence for the Washington Times, Bill Gertz. He's just published a book called Breakdown. I have a very good friend in Pakistan, one of the most important tribal leaders, who's been a good source of mine for many years. He's my age. He's 76 years old. He's the head of a national party in Pakistan. He was a Marxist during the Cold War, gave that up. He has 600,000 men in his tribe. I don't know how many women, but he always counts it as men. And that means, for me, 600,000 pairs of eyes and ears in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. When I went to the south side of Tora Bora in mid-December to try to intercept some of the Afghan Arabs escaping from Tora Bora, it was this gentleman, the head of this tribe, who had organized my trip to that particular area. It was called the Tira Valley, the most inaccessible part of Pakistan, surrounded by mountains. And just as we'd rented some horses, and just as we were about to embark up the Tira Valley, this was on December 11th, a messenger came from the tribal leader saying, please don't go in, we know you're going to be kidnapped for ransom. So we bypassed the Tira Valley and continued. We discovered from our tribal leader that Osama bin Laden had come out there through the Tira Valley on December 9th, 2 days before we got there, with about 50 people on horseback. They then got into SUVs and drove in to Peshawar, which is a city of 3.5 million, mostly pro-Osama bin Laden, anti-American, anti-Musharraf government, because these are the tribal areas. And it was as recently as 3 weeks ago that my friend, my tribal leader, I talk to him quite frequently, said that he had moved, Osama and his people had moved to Karachi, where there's been action recently. When I mentioned all this to Bill Goetz, he sent back an email yesterday saying the U.S. has some very real intelligence that Osama is alive, and my guess is that they have overheard bin Laden contacting a family member or his mother. And he said, this is the intelligence context of the failure to get OBL. By that he means the Pakistanis are very afraid that if they were to go in and get OBL, very difficult to do and a very bloody operation because he's a hero in the slums of Karachi and in the slums of Peshawar, if they were to go in there and try to get him out and then turn him over to the United States, that the United States then might turn its back on Pakistan. We've got Osama, the war is over, goodbye, as we've turned our back on Pakistan many times before. That seems to be what's going on. I have absolutely no doubt that Osama bin Laden is alive.
Arnaud?
Yes, sir.
One last question.
What is your judgment about the aid and assistance our country is giving to Afghanistan? Is it being put to good use? Are the right people getting it, the people in need? How do you see that taking place, or is it?
There's been very little aid so far. The Tokyo Donors Conference decided on $4.3 billion worth of aid. So far, about $600 million has come in, $300 million from the United States, but it's all humanitarian aid. For rebuilding the country, to try to help them rebuild their infrastructure, nothing has come in so far. And Karzai is quite desperate about this. I will be seeing his foreign minister tomorrow night in Washington for dinner, Abdullah. I know they're very upset by what's going on, and they know that they're not controlling anything outside of the capital, though they put up a brave front. But what's desperately needed is the road infrastructure to get commerce started again. When I drove from Quetta in Baluchistan to Kandahar, that was probably the worst ride I ever had in my entire life. You were driving through deep potholes the whole way. And that's what all of Afghanistan is like today.
Is our government committed in any way to help rebuild roads?
Yes, it is committed. And there's the road they want to focus on is the road from Kabul to Herat on near the Iranian border. And that itself would be a $600 million project. But nothing has started yet. I'm sorry?
What's holding it up?
I guess bureaucracy. I don't know if you remember, at the beginning, after the liberation of Kabul, we were seeing stories on TV about no government offices, no chairs to sit on, no desks, let alone typewriters or computers. And I was having lunch at the Pentagon one day with a good friend, one floor above the service secretaries. And I noticed that the corridors were lined with unused furniture from the part of the Pentagon that had been partly destroyed and rebuilt. So I wrote a column the next day saying, why don't we just put all of this stuff on a C-41 and take it out to Pakistan, which is what they eventually did. But somehow the U.S. government, as you know, at least since Secretary Baker was in power, has been slowing down considerably. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arnaud, for your tremendous insights. Ladies and gentlemen, the meeting today is completed, and I think there may be more refreshments outside. Thank you.